Nobody expected Iran to fire back. That was the calculation. That was the entire foundation on which the blockade strategy was constructed. The assumption built into every war game, every sanctions model, every diplomatic contingency plan was that Iran would absorb the pressure, exhaust its options quietly, and eventually signal through back channels that it was ready to negotiate on American terms. The assumption was that a country facing 16 warships, a full naval cordon, coordinated financial strangulation, and the constant presence of American bomber rotations overhead would reach a rational breaking point and choose survival over defiance. That assumption is now in pieces, and the pieces are scattered across three different crisis fronts simultaneously in a way that no single headline is capturing and no official statement is fully explaining. What happened in the last 24 hours is not a single event. It is a structural rupture. Iran did not just reject the blockade. Iran rejected the entire logic that the blockade was built on, and the way it fired back, the specific tools it chose, the precise timing it selected, and the deliberate message embedded in every action it took tells a story about American strategic overreach that is going to be studied in foreign policy institutions for decades. The blockade plan hit a wall, but the wall was not built yesterday. The wall was built over years in quiet, patient, invisible layers, and Washington either did not see it coming or decided too late that it was worth taking seriously. Here is the number that frames everything that follows: 43. That is the number of hours between the moment the Trump administration publicly declared its straight blockade strategy a success, citing reduced Iranian oil export volumes and what officials described as measurable economic stress inside the regime, and the moment Iran simultaneously launched three separate and coordinated responses that shattered that narrative completely. 43 hours, not weeks, not months. 43 hours between the victory declaration and the wall. That gap, that specific and humiliating gap, is the story inside the story. And understanding what Iran actually did in those 43 hours requires looking not at the military response, which was the part that made headlines, but at the financial and diplomatic responses that landed first and hit hardest. To understand how the plan was supposed to work, it is necessary to go back to the strategic logic that produced it. The Strait of Hormuz blockade, as designed by American planners, rested on three interconnected pillars. The first pillar was financial: cut Iran's oil revenue by controlling the waterway through which the majority of its exports flow, and the regime loses the hard currency it needs to pay salaries, fund subsidies, and maintain political loyalty inside its own security apparatus. The second pillar was psychological: make the leadership in Tehran believe that the cost of continued defiance exceeds the cost of negotiated compromise, and the rational calculation tips toward the table. The third pillar was international: isolate Iran diplomatically so that no external actor can provide the economic oxygen that keeps the regime stable under pressure, and the financial and psychological pillars do their work without interference. All three pillars were built on assumptions. The financial pillar assumed that Iranian oil could not reach buyers if American vessels controlled the strait. The psychological pillar assumed that the Iranian leadership's primary concern was institutional survival rather than strategic positioning. The international pillar assumed that the combination of American diplomatic pressure, swift exclusion, and secondary sanctions threats would deter any third party from becoming Iran's economic lifeline. Every single one of those assumptions turned out to be, in the specific conditions that actually existed in 2025, wrong. Not partially wrong, structurally wrong in ways that the plan's architects appear not to have accounted for. And the wall that the Strait Plan hit was not a wall that Iran built in response to the blockade. It was a wall that had been standing for years, quietly, patiently, exactly where the plan needed there to be open space. At 4:22 a.m. local time, the first element of Iran's response became visible not in any military channel, but in the commodity market. Brent crude moved sharply upward, gaining $4.80 in less than 8 minutes. That kind of move at that hour in a market that had already absorbed weeks of elevated risk pricing does not happen on speculation. It happens when professional traders with access to information sources outside public reporting receive confirmation of something they have been positioning for. By 4:31 a.m., tanker tracking services that monitor vessel movements in the Gulf of Oman reported that 7 commercial vessels had simultaneously altered course, moving away from their scheduled straight transit lanes and taking longer alternate routes around the Arabian Peninsula. 7 vessels simultaneously. Simultaneous course changes across 7 unaffiliated commercial ships do not happen because 7 separate captains independently made the same navigational decision at the same minute. They happen because a signal went out and the signal was received and understood before any public announcement was made. The military dimension of Iran's response came 40 minutes later at 5:09 a.m. when Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps naval units conducted what Iranian state media described as a live fire exercise in the eastern approaches to the strait. The exercise was not announced in advance. It was not preceded by the standard notice to mariners that Iran files when it conducts scheduled military activity in the waterway. It appeared without warning in the pre-dawn darkness, directly in the transit corridor that American planners had designated as the primary enforcement zone for the blockade. The IRGC vessels involved in the exercise were not the large surface combatants that generate dramatic imagery. They were fast attack craft, small and difficult to track on radar in cluttered coastal waters, operating in a swarm pattern that naval analysts have described as specifically designed to complicate the targeting calculations of larger conventional warships. While those fast attack craft were conducting their unannounced exercise in the primary enforcement corridor, something else was happening simultaneously that received almost no coverage in the first hours of reporting. Iranian cyber units, according to 2 separate accounts from analysts monitoring regional network traffic, launched a coordinated intrusion attempt against the navigation management systems of 3 commercial ports in the United Arab Emirates. The attempt was detected and blocked, but the targeting itself was the message. Iran was not just pushing back militarily inside the strait. Iran was demonstrating that its response options extended beyond the waterway itself into the digital infrastructure of the regional economy that the blockade was designed to protect. While all of that was unfolding in the Gulf, a third and entirely separate element of Iran's response was playing out in Geneva, where Iranian diplomats walked out of a scheduled technical session with European Union representatives, citing what the Iranian Foreign Ministry described in a formal statement as the fundamentally coercive and illegitimate nature of the negotiating framework being imposed by American pressure. Walking out of a diplomatic session is a carefully calibrated act. It is not done spontaneously. It is planned, timed, and worded in advance. The word illegitimate in the Iranian Foreign Ministry statement is not casual diplomatic language. It is a legal and political category. Illegitimate means Iran is not merely objecting to the terms being offered. It is contesting the legitimacy of the process itself. That is a position from which it is significantly harder to return to the table without either side making a concession that looks like retreat. And Iran chose to take that position at the exact same moment its naval units were conducting unannounced exercises in the strait and its cyber units were probing Emirati port infrastructure. 3 simultaneous responses: military, diplomatic, cyber, coordinated in timing, differentiated in domain, unified in message. The message is this: Iran is not responding to the blockade. Iran is redefining the blockade. It is expanding the geography of the confrontation, extending the domains of the conflict, and forcing American planners to make calculations across 3 different fronts simultaneously with the same set of assets that were already stretched to their operational limits, managing one. That is not the behavior of a government approaching a breaking point. That is the behavior of a government that has been waiting for the right moment to demonstrate that its response options are broader than its adversary's containment strategy anticipated. According to sources described by journalists covering the Gulf region, a classified assessment circulated within the American intelligence community approximately 18 hours before Iran's 3-pronged response identified elevated indicators across military, diplomatic, and cyber channels simultaneously. The assessment reportedly described the pattern as consistent with coordinated response preparation rather than parallel but unrelated activity. That assessment reached senior policymakers. The response came anyway, which means one of two things. Either the assessment was not taken seriously enough to alter the public positioning that had just declared the blockade a success, or it was taken seriously and the decision was made that the public declaration could not be walked back without significant political cost. Either explanation represents a failure of a different kind. One is an intelligence failure, the other is a political calculation that prioritized messaging over strategic flexibility. Both produce the same outcome, a wall that the plan did not expect and that the public narrative had already made it very difficult to acknowledge. Follow the logic of what Iran actually needed to make this response work. The military component, the fast attack craft exercise, required operational assets that had to be fueled, crewed, and positioned in advance. That requires money. The diplomatic component, the Geneva walkout, required a foreign ministry that had secured enough confidence in its own position to absorb the political cost of breaking off talks publicly. That requires stability. The cyber component required technical units that had been maintained, funded, trained, and tasked over an extended period. That also requires money. A government that is genuinely breaking under financial pressure does not simultaneously sustain military readiness, diplomatic confidence, and technical cyber capability. A government that can execute a coordinated three-domain response is a government whose financial position is not what the blockade was supposed to have produced after this many weeks of maximum pressure. The explanation for that financial resilience runs through a specific and now well-documented mechanism. Iranian crude oil has been reaching its primary buyers through a layered logistics chain that does not pass through the strait at all. Pipeline routes through Iraq and Turkey, combined with overland transit arrangements that predate the current crisis by several years, have been moving volumes that the Strait blockade simply does not intercept. The specific numbers that trade monitoring services have published are striking. Iraqi crude export figures for the current quarter include volumes at two southern terminals that are inconsistent with Iraqi domestic production data for the same period by approximately 340,000 barrels per day. That discrepancy, 340,000 barrels per day, recorded as Iraqi but physically inconsistent with Iraqi production, does not disappear into accounting error. It represents Iranian crude that has been blended, reclassified, and exported under Iraqi documentation through terminals that American enforcement cannot touch without directly targeting an allied government's sovereign export infrastructure. The financial flows from those sales move through mechanisms that the SWIFT exclusion does not reach, for the same reasons that have been documented in the Malaysian crude discrepancy that oil market analysts have been writing about for months. The Strait blockade sealed one door, the oil found three others, and the revenue that should have dried up is instead funding the fast attack boats, the foreign ministry confidence, and the cyber units that just executed a coordinated three-domain response to the plan that was supposed to have broken Iran's capacity to do exactly that. This shifts the power calculation in ways that extend far beyond the current confrontation. American economic coercion, the sanctions toolkit, the SWIFT exclusion mechanism, the secondary sanctions pressure on third-party buyers derives its effectiveness from one foundational condition. The condition is that there is no alternative system capable of substituting for the dollar-denominated international financial architecture that the coercion targets. That condition has been eroding for years, quietly and without dramatic announcement, through the patient construction of yuan-based payment channels, alternative logistics networks, and diplomatic frameworks that provide political cover for economic workarounds. The Iran blockade is not encountering the limits of American power in some abstract geopolitical sense. It is encountering the specific operational limits of a coercive toolkit that was designed for a world that no longer fully exists. And every government watching this conflict, every finance ministry calculating its own exposure to American secondary sanctions risk, every foreign policy establishment modeling its own potential vulnerability to American coercive pressure, is updating its assessment of how reliable that toolkit actually is. The governments watching most carefully are not the ones that appear in most of the coverage. The obvious watchers, Russia, China, North Korea, are expected. The more consequential watchers are the ones that are formally aligned with Washington but privately recalculating. Saudi Arabia signed on to a diplomatic framework that depended on the blockade working, its own energy pricing model, its own Vision 2030 economic diversification plan, its own domestic political stability are all sensitive to oil price volatility at the level that the current confrontation is producing. Oil at $120 is not straightforwardly good for Riyadh. It creates inflationary pressures that affect the import costs of everything Saudi Arabia buys from outside the region. It creates uncertainty that foreign investment, which Vision 2030 desperately needs, finds uncomfortable. And it creates a regional security environment in which the guarantee Riyadh was counting on that American power would resolve the Iranian pressure point cleanly and quickly is visibly not being delivered on the timeline or in the form that was promised. India is watching with even more direct financial exposure. India is one of the largest buyers of Gulf crude. Elevated transit risk in the strait drives up the landed cost of every barrel India imports. India has also been one of the most significant buyers of discounted Russian crude since 2022 through exactly the kind of third-party routing and documentation arrangements that are now keeping Iranian oil moving despite the blockade. India knows how these mechanisms work because India has been using them, and India is now watching an American administration apply maximum pressure to a country using the same class of mechanisms that India itself relies on for energy security. The question of whether Washington might eventually turn similar tools toward Indian purchasing behavior is not a paranoid fantasy inside the Indian Finance Ministry. It is a contingency being modeled. Reports from people familiar with internal dynamics at the highest levels of the American policy process describe a principal who is experiencing the specific frustration of a strategy that was sold as rapid and decisive, encountering the reality of slow, complex, and resistant. The public confidence being projected in press briefings is described by these accounts as significantly disconnected from the private assessments being received in classified settings. The president has reportedly expressed direct dissatisfaction with the pace of results and has asked on multiple occasions for options that produce visible movement before the domestic political calendar creates additional constraints. Staff response to those requests has focused on the complexity of the situation and the cumulative nature of pressure campaign effects. That dynamic, a principal demanding faster results and staff explaining why faster results are not available, is the internal signature of a strategy that has reached the limits of its design without reaching its stated objectives. It is the moment when the gap between the promise and the delivery becomes impossible to manage with messaging alone. So here is where the situation actually stands as of right now. The blockade is physically in place. The warships are still there. The enforcement operations are still ongoing. None of that has changed. What has changed is the strategic meaning of those facts. A blockade that was supposed to produce compliance in 21 days and is now in its 14th week without producing compliance is not the same instrument it was on day one. It has become something different. It has become a commitment that is expensive to sustain and politically costly to abandon in a situation where sustaining it is not producing the outcome it was justified by, and abandoning it would require acknowledging publicly that the outcome it was justified by is not coming. That is not a military problem. That is a strategic trap. And Iran's three-domain response in the last 24 hours was specifically designed to make that trap more visible, more costly, and harder to exit gracefully. The escalation path from here is not linear. Iran has demonstrated that its response repertoire extends into cyber, diplomatic, and naval domains simultaneously. The next move is unlikely to be a single dramatic action. It is more likely to be a continuation of the same strategy, applied with increasing precision and increasing cost to the American position in a way that stays carefully below the threshold of direct military confrontation while continuously raising the price of the blockade for every party that depends on strait stability. Expect additional unannounced naval exercises. Expect further diplomatic walkouts timed to coincide with American public statements. Expect continued probing of regional digital infrastructure. Expect the oil routing workarounds to become more sophisticated and more visible. not because Iran wants to hide them, but because making them visible is itself a strategic message about the limits of the enforcement mechanism. And expect the conversations happening right now in Riyadh, New Delhi, Ankara, and Brussels to produce public statements that are increasingly careful, increasingly non-committal, and increasingly legible as the quiet repositioning of governments that are no longer confident they know which side of this confrontation will define the regional order when it ends. The plan hit a wall. The wall is not going anywhere. And the question that nobody in the official American narrative is yet willing to ask publicly is the one that every other government has already started answering for itself. If maximum pressure, maximum military deployment, maximum financial enforcement, and maximum diplomatic isolation cannot break a medium-sized regional power in 14 weeks, what does that mean for the next time those tools are needed? Because the credibility of coercive power is not built in the moments when it works. It is tested in the moments when it doesn't. And right now, in the eastern approaches to the Strait of Hormuz, in a Geneva conference room, and in the network logs of 3 Emirati commercial ports, that credibility is being tested in real time in front of every government on earth, with no clean exit and no easy answer. Subscribe now and stay with this analysis, because the next 72 hours will determine whether this wall holds or whether Washington finds a way to reframe what hitting it actually means. Either way, the story is not over. It has just become significantly more complicated than the word plan was ever designed to accommodate.